By a lady called Amy Robsart.
He's talking about this.
She was the daughter of. No, she wasn't. She was the wife. I was put off by knowing somebody. She was the wife of Robert Dudley, the favourite of Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. If you've seen the film Elizabeth, by the way, this was the character played by Joseph Fiennes in the film Elizabeth. What they didn't actually mention in the film that I remember was that he was already married. Here he was in the royal courts, flirting away with the Queen, having a good old time. You know, this was the most powerful woman in the world. Of course, she was the virgin. Well, she was for a while anyway, but we're not sure how long she made it. But anyway, she was certainly unmarried, and she was a good catch, a huge catch. Robert Dudley was having a great old time. Big problem was, which of course he kept very quiet, he was already married to Amy Robsart, who was kept very much away from the royal courts. In fact, she was kept here in Oxford, just up the road from here at Cumnor, in Cumnor Palace. Now, what could Robert Dudley do? Well, guess what? One day, in fact, I think I know the exact date here, 16th of September 1560, Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of the stairs in her house. Very suspicious circumstances. All the servants had been sent away for the evening or the day. No witnesses as to why and how she fell, but fall she certainly did, and broke her neck and of course died. Now, Robert Dudley, who of course there was never irrefutable proof that he was responsible for his wife's death, but you can imagine almost everybody convinced that he must have had something to do with it, because it left him free to marry the Queen. The only thing was, though, the Queen wasn't quite so accepting, or she wasn't at all accepting, when she discovered that not only had he been married, but he was a possible wife killer. So he was pretty much thrown out of the royal circles, although he was accepted, by the way, much later in his life, he was accepted by the Queen. And there was never any actual proof to link him to the murder of his wife, but I guess rather like O.J. Simpson in the United States, although there was plenty of proof of that, wasn't there? But rather like O.J. Simpson, almost everybody is absolutely convinced that he did kill his wife, even though perhaps they couldn't quite. Well, they did prove it, didn't they? Anyway, I mean, but they got away with it anyway. Hope you all agree with me, perhaps. I don't know. But anyway, as I said, there was no absolute proof to link him to the murder of his wife, but you can imagine almost everybody convinced that he did it. So Robert Dudley, well, I guess, I mean, he lived, of course, but his poor wife certainly didn't. Her funeral was here in the church, and this is where she's buried, in the chancel, by the way, which is on this end of the church where everybody is buried, and she's still here. Tomorrow morning there'll be a service here. There are children at that service, and it's children that seem to see her more than anyone else. They often talk about who's that woman sat over there, and no one else can. No, certainly the adults don't seem to see what woman. Who are you talking about? Children see her a lot more than adults. I mean, adults have seen her too, dressed in Tudor dress. So that's why we're absolutely convinced it must be Amy Robsart, who died in very tragic circumstances, whether she fell or was pushed or whatever happened, it was tragic, and is buried here, died at a very young age. And so if you please try and visit the church while you're in Oxford. There is a memorial to Amy Robsart inside the chancel, and it's open. Well, it won't be open tomorrow morning because there'll be a service here, but most of the time it is open, and certainly until 7 o'clock most evenings you can come here and you can climb up the tower as well. This church. A man called Archbishop William Laud was executed because when he was Chancellor of Oxford University, this was during the reign of Charles I, when England was starting to head back towards Catholicism, by the way. Charles I had a Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, and his Archbishop, William Laud, was sort of Catholic-leaning tendencies, let's say. And while he was Chancellor of Oxford, he had erected outside the University Church here, which is still there, the statue of the Virgin Mary, the biggest symbol of the Catholic Church. He was fine whilst Charles I was king, but of course Charles I was defeated by Cromwell. And men like Thomas Cranmer were basically tried for heresy. The strongest evidence they had against Cranmer was that he had erected outside the church here, while he was Chancellor of Oxford, that statue, which we'll see in a minute. I want to talk about it here because it's quite noisy on the high street. And they found him guilty, of course, and they chopped his head off in London. He was brought back to St John's College, which was his old college, where he's buried in the chapel there. And Oxford now has a headless ghost. And again, many witnesses have seen him, particularly in the chapel, rolling his head along the ground. I'm serious, as if playing bowls with his own head inside the chapel, or indeed in the chapel quad. And again, the classic Hollywood ghost as well. People have seen him holding his head underneath his arm. You know, I mean, he is the headless ghost of Oxford. and it's at St John's College where he's buried and where he haunts. And I will show you the offending statue in just a minute that led to his death. Alright, so let's go that way. The church here was a multifunctional building. It's the oldest part of the university. This room here was used for teaching, and you can get lunches here tomorrow, by the way. You can actually have lunch in what was the first lecture room of the university, and the library, the first university library, situated above. So this is the most important part of the university, the university church. The chancel is just here. This is where everybody's buried, and where Amy Robsart haunts this part of the college, the church. There it is, above this lovely Baroque porch, and we're going to be blocked by the bus, I think. I just want to pick her up now, really. Well, you know, you can still see it above the bus.
Yeah, it's filmed already.
The statue of the Virgin Mary. Now, it is a miracle that it's still there, because at the end of the Civil War, Cromwell's troops marched triumphantly down the High Street here. Oxford was the last city to fall to Cromwell, and these were very puritanical men. They would hate to see that particular statue. Many of them took out their rifles, muskets, and took pot shots at that statue. And in fact, they were fairly successful, because both the head of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus was smashed to the ground. They are replacement heads. They're not the original heads. And if you look very closely, with binoculars, you can still see marks on the bodies of the Virgin Mary from Cromwell's troops when they shot there.
Oh yeah.
And by the way, while we're here, this was the scene of the worst hand-down violence in Oxford. Whenever there was a major incident, and anything could spark up a major incident, by the way, the bells of St Mary's here would ring to alert the students, and the bells of Carfax Tower, formerly St Martin's Church, at the other end of the street there, would ring to alert the townspeople. And the villagers would come into Oxford. In those days, Oxford was surrounded by villages and farmland. The villagers would come into Oxford with specially sharpened pitchforks and scythes and sort of dangerous farming implements. What do the students have to defend themselves? A book and a quill. A pitchfork will win every time. So a heck of a lot more students were killed than townspeople. And as I said, one incident led to over 60 students being killed, many more badly injured. There were limbs, there was blood, there was guts all over the place here on the High Street. There was said to be so much student blood that it flowed all the way down the High Street into the River Charwell. That's how much student blood there was. So if you ever hear some strange screams when you wander down the High Street on a quiet time of day, which there isn't, there has to be a quiet time of night, about 4 o'clock in the morning perhaps, you may hear the screams of some former student who was horribly hacked to death by a villager and a townsperson. Anyway, this was the scene of the worst violence. Let's get off this noisy street and down back. Behind me was built in 1588. Anyone know what happened in 1588? A very important date in English history.
Shakespeare was
No, pretty close though. I think.
Armada. He was the airman.
The Armada, well done. He's not the weakest link. Well done. Well done. Yeah, the Spanish Armada was in 1588. So in the year of the Spanish Armada, in the middle of Queen Elizabeth's reign, 1588, this house was built. But it's haunted by a lady who lived here and died here again during the English Civil War in the 1640s. The Burkett family lived here. Like most of Oxford families, they actually supported the Puritans. They're typical of Oxford, really. The university supports the royal cause, the town supports the parliament cause, the parliamentary cause. But most of Oxford families would have remained in Oxford, otherwise their house would have been completely, taken over by royalist troops. So the Burkett family were here. They had a beautiful young daughter called Prudence, who unfortunately fell in love with one of the dashing young cavaliers, who was obviously of the enemy. And in fact, he was one of the personal guard of Queen Henrietta Maria, the wife of Charles I, who was in residence at Merton College just down here. And she had her own personal guard, one of them a dashing young cavalier, who fell in love, or at least, well, I hope it was mutual. They fell in love with each other. And of course, the family were horrified. She was literally sleeping with the enemy. They threw her out the house, but at that time she didn't really care. She was in love. The only problem was he was forced elsewhere. He was a soldier. He wasn't necessarily. He had to go elsewhere. She couldn't go with him, but she made many attempts to get in contact with him. She was allowed back into her family home, but they weren't exactly welcoming. She had given the family a horrible name by sleeping with the enemy. But she was still hopeful that he would return. And apparently, whenever the doorbell went here, she came rushing down the stairs, and of course, he never returned. Whether he died or perhaps typical man went off with somebody else, we're not really sure. But whatever happened, he never returned.